the viewers to this show will not know the stats. So if you could just say, what was the basis of your article in terms of the numbers which backed up the issue about the poor white kids not getting a show, whereas everybody else seemed to?
Yeah, the stats are mainly about educational attainment, and they are pretty striking. And there's a gap between what you might call the white British, particularly white British working class people kids on free school meals. They are less likely to go to university than any other ethnic group, apart from Gypsy Roma. They have worse GCSE results than any other group apart from Gypsy Roma, and that gap is increasing. It's a remarkable statistic, I think, that of kids on free school meals in inner London, 48% go to university. I mean, that's a fantastic result.
Great achievement.
Of course, I'm not suggesting that everybody in London is poor, but these are the kids on free school meals. They're going to university. Outside of London, the figure is 26% go to university on free school meals, and amongst white British boys, it's only 13%. So we've got this big gap, and there's obviously three aspects to it. One is class, one is gender, one is race, and I don't know which is the more important. But we have a left behind group of people there for whatever reason. And so, yeah, they're the statistics. People have their own opinions about why they have fallen so far behind. And if you want to take more of a glass half full approach, which I do to a large extent, you could just say, well, it's not so much that they've fallen behind as the other groups have gone ahead of them. And maybe we can just learn from the other groups. It's great that inner London schools have been sorted out. It's great that relatively recent immigrant families are doing so well in this country. But one reason to be concerned about the white working class is it's an extremely big group. If we can get the white working class up to the same standards as Chinese girls, then it would be a huge boost to our productivity.
And if you, so one of the issues is that nobody will take the knee for white working class kids. It's a completely unforgotten area of society, as is, by the way, I suspect, white working class. And in my view, you can never, ever tell now the outcome of a general election because you don't know how people are thinking, especially a dominant group like white working class man and woman in this country. I think it's a significant issue, which I'm pleased to say bites the bum of politicians all day long. It's the great unknown out there. So if you were Boris tomorrow and you were looking at these stats, you'll say, well, something has gone seriously wrong with our country, that we have this big groupage that aren't doing well. What would you do?
Well, I would think we should try and learn from the groups that are doing better. I think that's one thing you can do with inequality. Rather than try and push people down, you try and learn from the people who are doing well. And since I focused here on schools, that seems to be the place to start. Michaela School in London, which is a predominantly black school, has done fantastically well as a free school. Been very controversial with a lot of people. It's a pretty old-fashioned disciplinarian system, but they've got outstanding school results. So maybe we can learn from what's happened in schools like that in London and transfer it to some of the left-behind areas. I think that's an obvious thing to do. More controversially, you could talk about increasing the number of grammar schools, which Theresa May toyed with, but like most politicians eventually found was a bit too much of a hot potato. I don't have the answers, quite honestly. I just think at the very least we should be acknowledging this gap here, because from the treatment it gets in the media, you would think it was completely the other way around, and it was institutional racism and institutional sexism is helping the white British dominate society, and certainly when it comes to schools and university, that is absolutely not what's happening.
What do you, so in some respects, some of the Afro-Caribbean families get blamed because the father's not there, and therefore the child gets raised on a single mum often. What could be the explanation for the lack of attainment of the poor whites? Is it the same issue? Do they have more family breakups than say the wealthier whites?
Well, yes, they do, and that may well explain the difference. I mean, there are lots of differences within the so-called BMME category. So, black African kids do quite a lot better than black Caribbean kids.
They do.
Now, it's very difficult to attribute that to any form of racism, and I think a lot of this stuff comes down to what we might call cultural issues, which is very difficult in practice for the government to do anything about. I mentioned in the piece that I asked a teacher friend of mine why he thought the white British boys were falling behind, and he said quite simply that immigrant parents are stricter and girls are better behaved. And there's probably a lot of truth in that, and there's not that much the government can do about it. But having said that, leaving the race issue aside and focusing just on gender, it has not always been the case by any means that boys have been behind girls in education. I can remember when girls' qualifications kind of exceeded boys for the first time, when they caught up with boys. Wasn't all that long ago, and now girls are steaming ahead. And you might say good luck to them. But it's not obvious that this is a natural thing, that girls are just better behaved and boys can't be bothered. Maybe boys are just becoming demoralised for whatever reason.
Yeah, well, that would, that would make us all. That would just about be the end, I should think. If the boys started throwing their hand in and saying, I'm feeling a bit low today, I can't be asked to do any work, that really would be terrible. So, if there's no simple solution to such a large, huge caucus of people, so we have this conversation in a year or 2 years' time. Has the situation got worse? Is there anybody? I don't hear one single politician shouting big about this.
Well, Ben Bradley is one. I mentioned him in the article. He asked a question about white working class boys in Parliament as an equalities question, and it was turned down because white working class boys don't have any protected characteristics. Which is actually not true. They do. They have a gender, they have a class, and they have a race. Those are the protected characteristics, not being non-white and gay and female. So you're right, most people don't really want to touch this. One of the inspirations for writing the article was that the government has decided that it is going to include an examination of why white British boys are underachieving in school in their Commission on Racial Inequality. And even that was controversial with a lot of people, felt that it shouldn't be in there, it should just be an issue focused on kind of Black Lives Matter stuff. And then maybe there's a point there, because it's not just about race, it might only be very slightly about race. Perhaps it's really a gender and a class thing.
Yes,
but there are three components to it, so it's a complex issue. There's a lot to it. I don't claim to have the answers. Maybe some people do.
I know that Trevor Phillips takes this issue in relation to white working class kids and their lack of achievement and lack of attainment in life, and that we should be focusing at least as much as that on. And you're right, on the BAME issue, it covers such a large kind of rainbow alliance of colour and creed and culture that sometimes it seems to me that it's too large, and we should segment it into smaller areas so you can see what the problem is more easily and deal with that problem.
Yeah, I agree. I don't like that term at all. It's a rather clumsy and ugly term, apart from anything else. I mean, one thing I would say, and again I mentioned this in the article, is I object to these effective quotas that an increasing number of companies are bringing in. You can't call them quotas legally, they're targets. Mm-hmm. But the BBC, for example, it set a target a few years ago of having 8% of its workforce, and I think management, being LGBT. Well, that's okay, but only 2% of the population actually identify as such. They set a 15% target of workforce and management being BMME, which it then upped to 20% as a gesture after the Black Lives Matter protest. Again, that's far higher than the proportion of BMME people, even in that kind of younger age group that they'll probably be recruiting from. than you see in the population at large. It has a 50% target for women. Well, that seems reasonable on the face of it. 50% of people in this country are women, but actually only 40% of women, only 40% of the full-time labour market is made up of women. So at every stage, in practice, you've got to have some kind of discrimination against people without these protected characteristics if you're going to meet these targets. It's rather like if you set a target, the BBC had a target of having 95% of its management white. Now, aside from the fact that it's unthinkable that the BBC would ever do that, that in a country where only 87%, I think, of the country are white British, that would require, somewhere along the line, with a nod and a wink, it would require discrimination against other races. And it's exactly the same, as far as I can see, with setting a target of 20%. So there's these subtle discriminations must be required somewhere along the line in that interview process in order for these targets to be met. And that's what I feel is unfair. I'm not a great one for targets and quotas in the first place, but it seems they should at least match the percentages in the workforce.
Yeah, but, you know, the BBC is completely, it's decided to have its own world and its own land. And I think the answer would be, well, if you want to pay, if you want that, that's fine. By the way, it's your choice whether you pay the license fee or not on that basis. After all, it's pay TV. It's £13 a month now. I think it's £157.50 for the year. So why don't you just say, yeah, that's fine. If you want to pay, if you want that kind of management and that kind of output, that's fine. Pay for it. And if you don't, thanks very much. And I think both you and I know what would happen. There would be no BBC within 9 months, as everybody said, do you know what I could do with the money?
Or it would have to change what it produces and you know, put forward something that people are prepared to pay for voluntarily.
Yeah.
You know, I don't think there's any serious argument now against not doing that with the BBC. I mean, the argument against privatising it, if you want to use that word, has always been an issue of the free rider problem. That, you know, the broadcaster beamed through the air, anybody can pick them up with an aerial. Now that's completely different, of course, because we've got Netflix and Amazon Prime and so on, and the technology easily exists for a subscription model. And I actually don't think it's something the BBC should be that afraid of, because they could sell internationally on exactly that basis. They might have to cut down on a few channels perhaps, or a few programs here or there, but I think it should have the confidence, given what an incredible archive it's got, apart from anything else, to say, no, actually, I think people will pay £12 a month for this.
Yeah. Well,
if it doesn't have the confidence, then it shouldn't be forcing people to do it. You know.
Yeah. Well, they could stop doing some of the things that they do. You know, I don't need the BBC to tell me what the weather is, for instance. I don't need them to do the sport and all the rest of it online. Leave that to somebody else. Leave that to commercial forces. Christopher, thank you very much indeed for your time. Been a good chat. I hope to be able to talk to you about other subjects of similar interest at some other time. Thank you very much.
Sure.
Cheers.